Hello again, Colette.
Hello, it's good to be back.
So I'm not sure what happened, but we had some technical issues here. Maybe the computer noticed I was overexcited about the conversation, the 10th episode of UXR Conversations. Maybe no one will be watching this live given the technical issues. Maybe some people will. I don't know. But my apologies to everyone who was looking forward to joining live. If you weren't able to due to the issues, it looks like some people are already joining. So my apologies. But more importantly, today we're here to again talk about the user research team at Spotify and their practice of user research, which I believe is quite interesting. And how you're pushing the boundaries there, really, of what's possible with user research and insights gathering. So again, a huge thank you to whoever joined today. And there's a lot more coming soon. So if you haven't yet, subscribe to my YouTube channel, check it out. More conversations to come, more content. It's going to be fun. Before we had to kind of leave the conversation due to all these technical things, you were sharing about your favorite Spotify playlist and your Spotify tips and tricks. I did not hear that properly. I would love for you to repeat that part.
Yeah, I think my favorite playlist is somewhat boring, maybe to most, but I love the Deep Focus playlist on Spotify. It's where I do a lot of my work too. It's ambient noise, basically, like nature sounds, no vocals, and it's just very peaceful and relaxing. So I love to do heads down work or analysis while listening.
That's awesome. I cannot listen to anything while I'm working. I just can't. I find it so distracting. And it doesn't matter if it's nature noises or other noises. Um, I would love to sleep to nature noises if I could, but some disagreement there between me and my partner. So no nature noises anywhere in the house. Um, I want to talk a bit about your background before we jump into Spotify. You studied neuroscience and you worked at a couple of pretty swanky universities, including Duke and Stanford. Um, and you worked as a research assistant at Dan Ariely's lab. For those of us who don't know who Dan Ariely is, can you first of all tell us a bit about him and how you got to be a research assistant in that lab, which has the very cool name of the Center for Advanced Hindsight at Duke University? Tell us more
Yeah,
about that.
absolutely. So Dan Ariely is a renowned behavioral scientist. He does a lot of research on decision making in particular, and just kind of the rational or irrational decisions that people make. I was really drawn to that lab after having done some neuroscience research, where it was we were studying toddlers and their numerical processing in EEGs, which was super fascinating. But the people who really could benefit from that work were parents. And most parents aren't reading scientific journals to pick up parenting tips. So I was really eager to dive into some more applied research. And in Dan's lab, they do very similar, like structured research. It's pretty like experiment based and survey based. And so it was really interesting to kind of continue along that line of research, but really in a more applied way. So we're able to understand how people make decisions, which is something that anyone can learn from and apply to in their day-to-day life. So I was really excited about that idea. And then once I got to the lab, I was just blown away by the creativity in their work, and really just like the interesting innate human questions that we were able to study at that time. So yeah, I was blown away by that work, and still a lot of that the seeds of creativity and research have kind of fueled the work that I do today.
That's really awesome. Dan Ariely is a fellow Israeli, so proud of that. He also went to UNC and Duke, which I thought is illegal. I thought you are never ever supposed to do that. There's such a rivalry between those two. And he authored a bunch of books, but my favorite is Predictably Irrational, The Hidden Forces That Shape Our Decisions. Classic. You should go read it if you haven't. I think it's a really great book for anyone in the user research field. What did you take from that experience into your user research roles later on?
Yeah, I think two major factors. One is what people say and what people do can be vastly different things. And sometimes we're not honest with ourselves about our actual actions because we see a more desirable self when we look in the mirror. The other piece, I think, is just the creativity, as we spoke about. So being able to study really interesting questions, but approach them from pretty much methods that we adapt from textbook methods that get us closer to the truth of humans and, in that case, how they made decisions. So I think the first piece, like, people don't always do what they say they do. I think a lot of my work at Spotify, I'm a bit weary of research that is solely reliant on the question of like, tell me about your last experience with X product. So I always like to understand both the perceived experience in addition to like their behavioral data experience, because we know that recall is sometimes flawed or it's biased. So being able to understand like what their actual experience was in addition to how they perceived that experience is really fascinating. And then in terms of creativity, I think I love just thinking about how to truly study something in depth. And so I've done some like kind of crazy methods where you're doing whatever possible to get as close as possible into a person's life, and what that means. So anything from hooking people up to eye tracking glasses and letting them go on New York City subway, and watching what that means as they interact with Spotify in moments when the car is packed versus in moments when they're walking on the street, etc. So really finding novel or clever ways to study people and how they interact with Spotify.
That's great. Well, before the live broadcast kind of broke down completely, I was saying that we are going to really jump in today into the practice of user research at Spotify. And if anyone has any questions for us, either now or later, please feel free to send them to us by commenting on YouTube or DMing on Twitter. We're going to be talking about this idea of kind of breaking the mold of UX research, pushing the boundaries, and learning more about how things are done at Spotify specifically. So let's jump into Spotify. I want to talk about the title of this conversation. I want to talk about the notion of breaking the mold, which, to be clear, is my choice of words, not yours. But is there a mold, in your opinion, that you are breaking to a certain extent at Spotify?
I think maybe the mold of where our insights come from, if that makes sense. So something I always think about are that my stakeholders should not be concerned with how we got the data, but more so believe in the truth of the data that we get. So a lot of my projects involve multiple disciplines and multiple research methods. And I'm not sure that it's super important for my stakeholders to understand the nuance of this was an in-home study with 12 participants versus this was an observational ethnography with 12 participants, for example. But what I do want them to know is more so like the depth or the truth of what we got to, and why that matters. So I think at Spotify, breaking the mold is less about like the user research discipline as a whole, but more so like insights disciplines coming together to form a more holistic story across the board. So we break the mold of user research by expanding it and adding more disciplines in and more methods in to get a more holistic picture.
In academia, a big part of how we assess the rigor of a journal paper, research that was done, is by looking at the method and understanding who was sampled and what those sample characteristics were, and is the method a good fit for the question. How does that happen at Spotify if that's not presented or assessed? How are the leadership within Spotify or whoever other stakeholders assessing the rigor of the research, or does that just not matter to what we do?
It absolutely matters. It matters maybe more than anything from a research practice, in the sense that I think it's super important for us as researchers. Like, we have a built-in peer review process, somewhat similar to an academic peer review process, where we assess research plans or even decks, etc., deliverables. to ensure that we are meeting a level of quality that we think is important. More so what I mean is on the storytelling side. Like, it's important for us to tell the insights as to the truth of what we learned, and explain that in the empathy building point with videos or bringing it to life with quotes, etc. But I think our leadership has a lot of trust. I think we're lucky that our leadership has a lot of trust in the rigor of our work. And it's on us as researchers to build and sustain the peer review process and ensure that we are making really thoughtful decisions about the research questions we tackle and the methods that we choose behind that.
I think you have to talk more about this peer review thing, because I don't
Yeah.
think I've heard of that in any UX research team that I know of, and I know quite a few. I've never heard those terms being used. How does that process work?
Yeah, great question. So I also obviously came from an academic background as well, and peer review was a big part of that process. So when I came to Spotify, I helped to develop some of the peer review work on my team. And what I thought was really fun was actually it was a two-way learning street, basically. So not only was the peer reviewer getting help, the peer reviewee getting help with assessing the rigor of their work. It was also a brainstorming session that we could carry out together and learn from each other from. So basically what that looks like is it's up to the individual to bring whatever deliverable it is, let's call it a research plan, to the peer reviewer. And we have some folks identified who are like, hey, this is my strong suit, come to me for these sorts of asks, etc. Because every researcher at Spotify, I think, is like pretty talented in one area or another. So we're lucky in that sense that we have a lot of talented folks to learn from. And then once you bring that piece, you ask for the type of feedback that you're looking for. So maybe it's that you're not sure which method to choose based on the research questions that you have asked, or maybe it's even that you're not sure how to phrase the research questions given that the product team doesn't entirely know what they're looking for, etc. And then you kind of talk through that together with the peer reviewer in kind of a brainstorming fashion, where you're thinking about the nuts and bolts together as researchers. I'm a strong believer that any research output is better with multiple brains behind it. And I think the peer review process is a way to enable that, even if you're the only IC individual contributor on that piece.
That is pretty incredible, I have to say, and good for you. So do you also have like the two reviewer system where reviewer number 2 is a bit nasty and reviewer number 1 is the nicer one? And how does that work?
Just no, more collaborative, just one person. And it's also kind of fun too, because that can spur a lot of mentorship relationships that might go beyond a project level if you find more value in learning from that person longer term as well. So I think it's been a really fun process and something that we're continuing to hone as we go on. But I think it's been really valuable in building a mentorship community and also ensuring a really high level of quality in every piece that we put out.
That's really great. And yeah, I mean, if other teams aren't doing this, this seems like a great idea. I think you need a certain team size and structure to accomplish this, but this is something to aspire to if you're not doing it yet. So that's great. Can we take more of a bird's eye view now on how research or insight collection works at Spotify? Who are the people involved? And I want to bring in, we have a question from Tiana about this, which is related. I'm curious about the makeup of the UX research team at Spotify. How do different backgrounds affect your approach to research and analyzing data? So same question there. What's the makeup of everyone involved in gathering insights?
Great question. I think it typically looks at least like user research and data science. So user research and data science are actually on the same team, which is called product insights. So I think that's what I mean to my earlier point too of not necessarily having to explain how we got to the insights, but more so explaining the truth that we get to in the story, because oftentimes we're mixing multiple methods together, and it's on us to determine the rigor, but it's also on us to then tell that story in a way that makes sense to folks who might not know anything about data science or user research, but really need that information to be able to make critical business or product decisions. So at the base, basically, product insights is made up of two disciplines, user research and data science. I think these are really amazing partners. I think from a user research perspective, you can't get a better partner in insights than a data scientist because your skill sets are extremely complementary. So what I mean by that is data scientists are really good at understanding overarching trends of what's happening in the data, like what are the trends we see at scale. But they're not as good at answering like why those trends exist. Because with every single trend, you can imagine that that's like millions of users' data points equaling up to like the height of that graph. So it's on us as researchers because we are really good at answering why questions, like, you know, why this particular trend exists or why users behave the way they do. And so you can see that they're kind of natural partners in that way because any question that, especially like I work a lot with senior leadership for Spotify Free, and any question that we want to be able to answer, we can't have a whole bunch of caveats like, hey, there's a trend that's going like this, but we don't understand why. Or, hey, users are motivated to do this, but we don't know what that means at scale. So we really try and provide holistic insights, especially when leadership are making complex decisions to ensure that we have a well-grounded insight story and that we enable decisions that are grounded in what we know about our users and our product.
I mean, I couldn't agree more that this is a natural partnership, such a natural partnership between two disciplines. But the fact is, in many companies, I think that partnership is either non-existent or much weaker than it is at Spotify. And there are multiple reasons for that. For example, often organizationally, data science and user research are not in the same group at all. And maybe data science reports into engineering and user research into products or into design and so forth. So it sounds like even organizationally, you're kind of together in this, and that has a positive effect on your ability to work together. But I don't want to put those words in your mouth. What enables you to work so well together? Because it's a natural partnership, but it often doesn't occur. So what is it about how things are at Spotify?
Yeah, that's a great question. To me, I think there are two reasons for it, and I think you hit the nail on the head with the organizational structure. We're naturally set up to collaborate because we are on the same team. So we naturally have team rhythms, like weekly meetings, etc. We're discussing our work and organically finding opportunities to collaborate. So it's really built into how we work. You know, I sit by data scientists as well typically when we're in the office. So I can just spin my chair around and ask them what they're working on, or potentially even get their take on how to partner with a piece that I'm just starting. So we have a built-in collaboration from the start. But I think the other piece is that our OKR planning process for product, so basically like where we set out the product timelines and goals that we want to hit on a quarterly basis, is extremely collaborative as well. So oftentimes there, we're thinking through together as an entire product team with product managers, designers, engineers, data scientists, etc. We're thinking through, hey, what are some of the upcoming goals that we want to hit as a product team? And what does that mean in terms of, our open questions that we don't fully understand, or what assumptions are underlying the risks that we're taking on here? And so being able to understand that from a team perspective, and then being able to advocate for either user research, data science, or both together to say, hey, we really should better understand this. And we think the best way to do that is, X, Y, or Z project.
I have so many questions. I mean, I'm kind of curious about something very technical, I suppose. So can you clarify when you're creating a deck or some other kind of output of research, a deliverable that you then want to present to your stakeholders, are you always collaborating on that with your, the data scientists you work with and other partners? Is there ever a case when just you as a user researcher creates this deliverable? Because that's still my experience to this day, that more often than not, as user researchers, we are creating deliverables and maybe we collaborate here and there. And hopefully that collaboration becomes stronger and stronger because there is huge value in that. But I often work alone or with other researchers, not necessarily in such a tight collaboration with other disciplines. So when you're preparing the output of the research, you talked a bit about the planning, What does that look like? And is it always with someone else in the picture?
So my work today, the answer is mainly yes. And I love that. I think it's so much fun. And I'll step back to explain that a little bit. So currently on my team, in addition to user research and data science, we also have behavioral science, analytics engineers, and data visualization experts. So that's a lot of disciplines to wrap under one team. But we think it's actually a really powerful combination. So oftentimes now, actually, my work is across maybe even 4 different researchers or 5 different researchers with these different insights backgrounds. And we're all partnering on a piece of work that might last a quarter, and understanding the same research question from these different angles. So then it does become really important to be able to tie all of those different data streams together in the final report. And that's a highly collaborative process because everyone knows their own data really well. But we all also can then see how our pieces fit together and overlap across each other for common themes. So I would say that in the deck writing process that I go through these days, it's highly collaborative, and we all really, like, ideally when we're not working from home, we kind of sit in a war room almost and spend some time whiteboarding out what we've learned, and having really tight communication along the way as well. Like, we have meetings every other day to talk about what we're learning and how that connects to each other's work, so we can have follow-ups as well. Obviously, not every project is going to fit this exact format. Like, you can think of a usability study, for example, which probably wouldn't benefit as much from these other disciplines. So it's not to say that that is always the case, nor should it always be the case. But we found that that's particularly valuable for these really deep foundational questions that help fuel our future direction as a product team and as a business team.
I have a couple of questions here. Rahina, thank you for your question. So again, this is just a question around the general day-to-day work of a UX researcher and the collaboration with these other people, data science and others. Is there anything you haven't mentioned about that collaboration? For example, I'm curious to hear a bit more about the different roles. When I think about breaking the mold, I've never heard of a data visualization specialist in a team, or that engineering role you mentioned. These really are fairly novel concepts to me. How does that collaboration work on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think this is something that we're thinking about and trying new ways to do all the time. I'll speak specifically about a particular process that I call simultaneous triangulation, which is a fancy word of basically saying a fancy word to basically say using different methods at the same group of people at the same time. So what this typically means is, for example, I'll give you an example of if I'm doing research on a diary study to study a particular population over a few weeks, I might get some help from a data scientist to be able to track their data with consent, of course, every single day that they're submitting a diary study entry. And at the same time, our data viz expert could make a dashboard so that I could also track some of that data in a visual way. And I think between the trio of those different disciplines, we get really interesting and rich input from the data side. We're getting a log of every single action that they take for the types of data that we're interested in looking at. From a user research perspective, we're getting the flip side of that experience, which is their perceived version of what happened or their recalled version of what happened. And then in a dashboard, we're able to see what that trend looks like over time, right, with these different individuals and their behavioral data. So I think that there's the ways of working change depending on the types of work that we take on and what we need from each other at that point in time. But that's where I definitely emphasize starting from the planning phase, where we're extremely explicit on here's the research question we're tackling, and here are how our different methods fit in to be able to understand that, because we have to coordinate not only the groups of people that we're studying, but also the time frame, and then particularly what each discipline can add to basically counterbalance the caveats of each method. Because in the diary study example that I just gave, you might imagine that a participant might have trouble recalling every single action that they took on Spotify, right? But from our data science perspective, we can capture that rigorously. And then from our data viz folks, our participants might not recall their trends over time, but our data viz folks can help us look at that. So we're taking all of that data sources together, and then we're doing analysis together too to understand how these different pieces play together and what that means for our overall findings, and also to point out discrepancies. So I think this is really the benefit of simultaneous triangulation is like, imagine you ran a diary study and you weren't doing any sort of behavioral data tracking. And from your diary study, someone says, yeah, I listen all day long. Spotify is a huge part of my life. And then if you weren't able to see their data, you would just believe them because that's what the data is telling you, right? But then if we were to look at the data logs from their day, and maybe we see that they listened for an hour and a half, and then we go back to them, we say like, hey, looks like you only listened for an hour and a half. Can you tell me what you mean by that? Or what did you mean by listening all day? And they're like, oh, I meant every moment I had free time. And they're like, okay, I get it. That's what it means. It's like, that's your guiding principle for when you turn on Spotify. Is like, I have it on whenever I have a spare moment, for example. So it really yields richer insights because you're able to understand it from multiple perspectives and then follow up with one of the data streams if something isn't making complete sense, if they're in any way conflicting.
I'm not sure if you realize this, but I am positive that many people listening to this, watching this now or later, they will not have to imagine what may happen if they don't collect the behavioral data or the log data as they collect the diary data, because they're not. That is their reality.
Yeah.
Simultaneous triangulation is not happening in many teams and many companies. So this is super interesting. And again, I think it really is an example of breaking the mold of UX research. So another great example. And thank you everyone for the questions so far. Really appreciate it. This is awesome. We have another great point here, a thought-provoking question from Kilin. Thank you. Half of the UXR team I work for has formal education in HCI. The other half does not. At times, this creates a rift in terms of best practices. What's the best way to tackle this issue? Any thoughts on that?
First, I want to caveat it with saying that, this is not my area of expertise. I'm happy to give my thoughts, but I'm by no means an expert in, HCI best practices or, kind of any sort of resolutions on that front. I guess my 2 cents in the matter, though, is really trying to understand, to me, like, the mark of a good researcher is being able to pick up on what the right questions are to ask, and then following that up with pointing the right method, which may or may not be like the perfect textbook methods, but is the right tool to be able to answer that in a robust way. So for me, like, I always encourage other folks on my team or other folks that I mentor to really think critically about what question it is that you're trying to answer, rather than relying on potentially like a go-to method. So for me, like, I always try and get at the root of like, what are people really trying to ask? So for example, if a stakeholder is like, hey, I need a survey, it's like, why? What do you really need to understand? Because I might have a better way to get you what you truly need to know than what you're specifically asking for. So I think it's, in terms of when it comes to best practices, I think the best practice for me is just depth of critical thought, and really ascertaining what the right question is or what the most impactful question is for the time, whether that's something someone poses to you or a different version of that, and then being able to assess the right method to use or the right tool in your toolkits to be able to use to go at that. And I mean, in my team, for example, I work on Spotify free, and so part of that experience is the ad experience. And oftentimes, it's a very different experience studying an ad product than it is studying a product that someone might use day to day with a lot of intentionality. Like, for example, studying Google Sheets, for example, because people might not have the same intentionality going into an ad experience as they might a Google Sheets experience. So for me, oftentimes that means I have to create clever or crafty ways to get at that, which might not be like extremely textbook, but they're extremely rigorous and they're carefully thought out to be able to ascertain whatever the data is that we need to gather. So that to me is how I would answer that question. And to me, it's not about like where education lies or, the like what might be a textbook method. To me, it's all about like, are you employing the right tool and have you really thought about the right questions to answer? So I hope that answers your question. But again, like, please take this with a grain of salt.
And I do want to press you on this because I call these things conversations, but I cannot help doing a bit of interviewing. I am a researcher as well.
Fair enough.
You do work with people from very different disciplines and very different training, academic training and otherwise. There is a potential there for that to create a rift, not just in terms of best practices, but just in general. And yet it sounds like you kind of get along okay. And that if anything, this is a learning experience, a growth experience, which maybe even has changed you as a researcher and how you think about your craft. What do you think enables that, or you know, what's the trick for getting along a bit better with people who are from very different disciplines than yours?
That's a great question. I'll tell you a little bit about how I went about that on my current team. So as I mentioned, those are the 5 insights disciplines, and we partner quite often together. We started off by actually having a lunch and learn where every single person presented on their own discipline. And they said things along the lines of like, what is my discipline good at? What can my discipline not do? What kinds of questions can you ask me? And how do you spend your time? Like, what are your core skill sets and how do you spend that time? And we each went through and talked about what that looked like for each different discipline. And I think that was really valuable because it put everything out on the table. And it was like, okay, here's what these different disciplines are. And then what I try and do with every project now is when we get to carving out the research questions and the methods that we'll use, I really try and think about leveraging the strengths of each individual. Because I think what's really powerful about having such a mixed methods team is that we have so much superpower in each individual method, but each individual method is also limited. So being able to harness the strengths of everyone is really, really impactful for bringing the team together because everyone has a seat at the table, everyone has a voice of the decisions, but it's only in working towards that same common goal of that research question and understanding how we each play a role in doing that we're able to harness the best of what we all can bring to the table. So I think it's been a really fun learning process because for me, I hadn't heard of analytics engineers before a few months ago either. We just spun this team up in January. And so for me, it was also a steep learning curve to be like, tell me about your discipline and what can you do? Like, tell me about this. And then in talking together, we learned about some really interesting things. Like for context, analytics engineers are pretty much like these amazing data wizards who are able to cleanly organize data sets and really have a knack for storing clean data. And user researchers can learn a lot from them, right? We don't have very clean data. Typically, our data is super messy. So in talking to them, I even learned some best practices for myself about how to better structure like the survey data I get back for cleaner and quicker analyses, which was amazing. But then also even on projects, we've thought about oftentimes like the data sets and the data sources that we're using and then creating as a result of this piece. So if we study a really interesting population, we're then able to create a data set to enable other data scientists to track or assess the effects of their A/B tests, for example, on this population. So to me, I think it's not about like a divisive conversation about who's right or who's wrong, because everyone has so much to bring to the table that it's about leveraging each other's strengths.
Incredible. We started late, and I do want to end soon to be respectful of everyone's time, especially yours. I do have a couple more things I have to ask. First of all, to the extent you're able to share, is there any, you've already shared 2 or 3 just incredible examples about how you really are pushing the boundaries on your team and collaborating so well with a bunch of disciplines that don't really exist in many research teams or insight gathering teams. But I'd love to know if there's any recent evolution in your team or upcoming evolution in terms of how you work, in terms of the research practice which you're excited about or you're considering at this point. Is there anything you're able to share around those lines of something either recent or that you're thinking about changing in terms of how you work, which could be beneficial to the rest of us?
Yeah, there's one thing in particular I'd like to share. So something that we've been thinking a lot about is how to drive action from really deep foundational pieces. Sometimes it can take a year to, or even organizational changes happen as a result of foundational research. And sometimes the actual product experience isn't changed as quickly. So something I've been thinking a lot about is how to drive quicker action and really prove the value of this foundational research that we typically do. So what I've been thinking a lot about and what I did in a recent project was actually run experiments predicated on some initial foundational knowledge that then we were able to analyze over that same time period to be able to report on not only all the foundational insights that we learned, but also any causal changes that we were able to make as a result of experiments. So in particular, calling out A/B tests as one form of experiments and behavioral science as another form of experiments. So what that means is basically we started out doing a little bit of exploratory analysis, and we were able to quickly identify hypotheses that we thought would have particularly strong product impact or business impact in this case as well. And we were able to launch those experiments early enough on in the project based on the hypotheses we had already kind of shaken out from the foundational work, and then be able to report on them at the end of the project to basically say, not only did we learn this about our user group, for example, but we were also able to prove that we were able to improve their experience by X amount as a result of these experiments. And I think that that's a really compelling way to drive action and kind of enable product teams to take on these foundational pieces and the next steps quite quickly. And it's something that I'm continuing to think about. But again, it involves partnership with other disciplines. And it really, it becomes a really powerful tool, especially speaking as like a user researcher. That's not something that's like typically within our toolkit. And oftentimes foundational work is like, oh, that's interesting, but what can we do about it? Or what's our, ammo to do something quickly about it? And experiments are a great way to counteract that, to basically say like, hey, here's the opportunity that's on the table because we've not only learned this really interesting truth about humans, but we're able to prove how that impacts their experience through an A/B test or a behavioral science experiment.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing that. If anyone watching has one final question, we'd love to take it. Until then, I'll ask mine. This has been very inspiring, the way you work, the way you think about things. I wonder, what's your inspiration or your team's inspiration? Who do you look to? Other research teams, other researchers? Have you noticed anything that was in particular interesting to you at Spotify in terms of how other research teams are working? I'm curious to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always inspired by people who are also pushing the boundaries in other ways. One example that comes to mind from a fellow colleague at Spotify was pushing the boundaries in terms of how we share insights. So one of my colleagues actually put on a play to showcase different persona types. And I thought that was an extremely compelling and interesting way to showcase and bring to life these personas that they had done, a ton of research on. But then they went the whole 9 yards too. They had a red carpet, they had popcorn, they had an audience, and then they put on this performance that the script was rooted in the insights that they found, and even direct quotes from different people based in their interviews. So for me, I think it's really inspiring to take a lot of knowledge or a lot of inspiration from the people who are thinking about things differently, and really trying to do whatever it takes to make your insights more vigorous and more compelling, because I think those are the two driving factors of any researcher. And I also try and think about like what we can learn from other disciplines. So like other insights disciplines or other forms of research that exist out there. So I read a lot of like different types of research articles or things like that out there to try and see what other disciplines are thinking about, what problems they face, and how they tackle them, et cetera. Because I think at the end of the day, like research is research, and it might take different shapes and different forms by different disciplines. But at the end of the day, we're very similar in a lot of ways too. So I think we can learn a lot from each other and from our fellow researchers who might be in different organizational types or in different technically insights roles. But there are a lot of really, really cool and talented folks out there. So pretty endless source of inspiration, to be honest.
That's awesome. Killian is saying, I'm bringing that persona play idea back to my team. That's amazing. There you go. We've inspired at least one person today. We have done our job.
I have to give a shout out to Cassie and Carolina at Spotify for the credit is all theirs for that. The credit is all theirs.
That's awesome. How can people reach out to you if they want to get in touch and learn some more, or maybe get mentorship or whatever it is you want to offer? What's the best way to get in touch?
LinkedIn is the best way, I think, to get in touch with me. Feel free to write me a message there, and I'll do my best to respond promptly.
Awesome. So I think we will end there. Colette Calendar, Senior User Research at Spotify, thank you so much for joining me in this fake studio of mine somewhere in the middle of Mountain View. And my apologies to everyone watching this for the technical glitches that were haunting us at the beginning, but it all worked out. And thank you for everyone who was asking questions and interacting. If you ever want to ask any other questions or have a conversation as well, I'm at noamseg@gmail.com or at noamseg on the Twitter, and I would love to chat with you. And that's it. Have a good evening and have a good rest of the week, everyone, and stay healthy and catch you next time. Bye for now.